Welcome back, everyone, to another story. We really hope you enjoy this one. My name is Ryan. I'm 24 years old, and for the last year, I've been working as a beta tester for a small tech startup called Nextlink. They were building something they called a full-dive VR pod, not just a headset, but an entire chamber you climbed into that could simulate touch, temperature, even weight distribution on your body. It sounded like science fiction when I first read the job listing, but the pay was solid, and I've always been a sucker for new tech, so I signed up without thinking twice. Most of my job was pretty simple. I'd climb into the pod, run through whatever build the engineers had pushed that week, and then fill out a report about bugs, glitches, anything that felt off. It was honestly one of the more fun jobs I'd ever had. Most days felt like getting paid to play video games, except the games weren't finished yet. And sometimes that meant dealing with genuinely broken software. The project I was testing that week was something new called Avatar Sync. It was supposed to let you scan a photo of literally any person and then experience the pod as if you were inhabiting their body, full sensory feedback, their approximate height and proportions, even attempts at replicating things like balance and center of gravity. The engineers were incredibly excited about it, calling it the next step toward true digital embodiment. I didn't fully understand the tech behind it, but I understood enough to know it was ambitious. I was paired that day with one of the other testers, a woman named Sophie, who worked 2 floors up in the design department. She was sharp, funny, always had her hair pulled back in this messy bun that never seemed to move, no matter what she was doing. We'd worked together a handful of times before and got along well enough that testing together didn't feel awkward. "Hey Ryan, you ready to be someone else for an hour?" Sophie asked me, grinning, as she pulled up the intake terminal, born ready. I said back, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The process was simple enough. You took a photo of your test partner, uploaded it to the intake terminal, and the system would build what the engineers called an avatar shell. Based on the image, once the shell was built, you climbed into the pod, and the system would essentially map your consciousness onto a simulated version of that person's body for the duration of the session. Sophie took my photo first, no big deal, and went into the pod first to test out being me. She came out 10 minutes later laughing about how weird it felt to be 6 inches taller. "Okay, your turn," she said. "Camera you." Now I stood still while she took the photo, and then it was my turn to climb into the pod. The inside of the pod always felt a little like lying down inside a padded coffin. If a coffin had touchscreens and 100 sensor pads pressed against your skin, I settled in, the lid closed over me, and the screen in front of my face lit up with a loading bar labeled Avatar Shell Compiling. I remember thinking it was taking longer than usual, the bar crawling forward in fits and starts, instead of the smooth progress I was used to seeing. Then the whole pod shuddered. I want to be clear, this had never happened before in any test. I'd run the pod, usually just hummed quietly while it worked. But this time, there was an actual mechanical shudder, followed by a burst of white noise through the speakers, and every light in the chamber flickering at once, a warning message flashed on the screen. Something about a synchronization conflict, before the whole display went black. I lay there in the dark for a second, genuinely unsure whether I should try to force the lid open or wait it out, and that's when I felt it. It started in my chest. A strange tightness that wasn't painful exactly, but definitely wasn't normal. I felt pressure building right around my sternum, like something underneath my skin was rearranging itself. I tried to sit up, but the pod's harness held me flat, and in the dark, I couldn't see what was happening. I could only feel it my shirt, which had been loose a second ago, suddenly felt tight across a chest that hadn't been there before. I sucked in a breath, and the air that came out sounded wrong, higher, thinner, not the voice I'd had my entire life. "Hey, guys, something's happening in here," I called out, and even as the words left my mouth, I barely recognized them. The pod speaker crackled, and I heard one of the engineers shouting something about an emergency shutdown. But before anything happened, the sensation spread. The tightness moved down through my torso, my waist pulling in at the sides while my hips seemed to widen against the padding of the pod, my whole skeleton feeling like it was being gently but firmly reshaped from the inside out. My legs tingled, my thighs feeling like they'd rounded out, my calves thinning. I could feel my hair, which I kept short, suddenly weighing more against the back of my neck like it had grown several inches in the span of a few seconds. The lid finally hissed open and hands reached in to help me sit up. But the moment I looked down at myself, I froze completely. My hands, resting in my lap, weren't my hands anymore. They were smaller, the fingers more slender, nails longer than I'd ever kept mine. My chest, now unmistakably a woman's chest, pressed against a shirt that had been mine an hour ago, but now looked like it belonged to somebody else entirely. I looked up and saw 3 of the engineers standing there, all of them staring at me with expressions somewhere between horror and disbelief. "Ryan, is that you?" one of them asked quietly. I opened my mouth to answer, and the voice that came out was light, soft, completely unfamiliar, and yet somehow I knew instantly whose voice it was. "I think I'm Sophie now," I said, my new voice cracking on her name. Sophie, who had been standing near the terminal reviewing data, spun around at the sound of her own name coming out of what used to be my body, and just stared. "Oh my God," she said, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, that's me." The next hour was complete chaos. The head engineer, a stressed-looking guy named Marcus, kept pulling data logs trying to figure out what had gone wrong, muttering about a corrupted sync file and a feedback loop none of them had ever seen before. The working theory, as far as I could piece together, was that the Avatar sync software hadn't just simulated Sophie's body inside the pod, it had actually begun physically remapping my real body to match the scan data, treating the biometric information as a target state rather than a temporary simulation. Somewhere in that process, the safety limiters had failed, and instead of reverting once the session ended, the changes had simply locked in. I sat on the edge of an exam table in the company's tiny medical office, wrapped in a blanket because none of my old clothes fit anymore, staring down at legs that weren't mine, feeling my own heartbeat thudding through a chest that hadn't existed a couple hours earlier. "Can you fix this?" I asked Marcus for probably the 10th time we're working on it, he said, not meeting my eyes, which was somehow worse than if he'd just said no. They kept me at the office until nearly midnight running scans, comparing data, trying to reverse engineer whatever had happened. By the time they finally let me go home, nobody had a solution, only a promise that their best engineers would be looking into it around the clock. Sophie drove me home since I obviously couldn't drive in a body I didn't know how to operate yet, my depth perception thrown off by several inches of height difference and a center of gravity that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. We sat in her car outside my apartment for a long moment before either of us said anything. "I'm so sorry," Sophie finally said, her voice thick. "This isn't your fault," I told her, and I meant it. None of us knew the software could do this. We sat there a little longer before she reached over and squeezed my hand, my new, smaller hand, and told me to call her the second anything changed, good or bad. Walking into my own apartment that night felt like breaking into a stranger's home. My key didn't fit right in my numb, unfamiliar fingers. My reflection in the hallway mirror stopped me dead in my tracks. A woman I didn't recognize looked back at me with my own startled expression stretched across features that weren't mine. Dark hair falling past her shoulders, wide eyes, a face that was undeniably Sophie's. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes just staring, trying to reconcile the fact that I was looking at myself. The first week was the hardest week of my entire life. I couldn't fit into any of my own clothes, so Sophie, unbelievably kind considering the circumstances, brought over a bag of her spare things for me to wear. I remember standing in my bedroom holding up a bra for the first time in my life, having absolutely no idea how the clasps worked, eventually resorting to video tutorials just to figure out the basic mechanics of getting dressed. My balance was completely off for days, my hips wider than I was used to navigating, my center of gravity sitting somewhere entirely different than it used to, so I kept clipping door frames and misjudging how much space I took up. Work was its own nightmare. Nextlink put both me and Sophie on paid leave while they investigated, worried about liability, but the isolation made everything worse without a job to distract me. I spent my days in my apartment slowly learning how to exist in this new body, calling Sophie almost every day because she was the only person who could remotely explain what any of it was supposed to feel like. She'd talk me through things like how to sit without feeling like I was going to tip over, how to walk in a way that didn't feel like I was fighting my own hips the whole time, small things that apparently just came naturally to her but felt like relearning basic motor skills to me. By the second week, the engineers had made zero progress reversing whatever had happened. Marcus called to explain, awkwardly, that the corruption in the sync file had apparently overwritten the biometric baseline they needed to revert me, meaning as far as their systems were concerned, this was simply what I looked like. Now there was no backup, no snapshot of my old body stored anywhere they could use to restore me. The moment he said that, out loud, I remember sitting on my kitchen floor for a long time just trying to process it. My old body, the one I had lived in for 24 years, was simply gone, deleted from existence as far as any system was concerned. Sophie came over that night with takeout, probably sensing I shouldn't be alone. I sat across from her at my kitchen table, both of us picking at noodles. Neither of us was really eating, and eventually she just asked me straight out, "How are you actually doing with all this?" I laughed, a short, humorless sound in a voice that still didn't feel like mine, and told her I honestly had no idea. I said I kept waking up, hoping it had all been some elaborate dream, and every morning I was disappointed all over again. She reached across the table and took my hand. You know, she said slowly, for what it's worth, you're handling this 1,000 times better than I would if it happened to me. I don't know about that, I said back. She squeezed my hand and told me that whatever happened next, reversible or not, she wasn't going anywhere. That we were in this together whether the company ever fixed their software or not. Something about the way she said it made the whole situation feel just slightly less impossible. Over the following weeks, I slowly started figuring things out. Sophie taught me how to do basic makeup, more out of necessity than vanity, since apparently my new face read as tired. Without at least a little effort, she showed me how to walk in the low heels she'd left behind, how to sit in a skirt without flashing the entire room. Small practical lessons that started to chip away at how foreign everything felt. I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights I cried harder than I ever had in my life, mourning a body and a life I hadn't even realized I was so attached to until it was gone. But somewhere around the 6-week mark, something started to shift. I caught myself one morning doing my own makeup without needing to think through each step. My hands finally remembering the motions Sophie had shown me dozens of times. I caught my reflection afterward, and instead of the usual jolt of unfamiliar panic, I just looked at myself for a second and thought, not bad. That small moment surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened since the accident. Nextlink eventually settled with both of us. A substantial payout, along with an agreement that neither of us would sue, given how catastrophically their software had failed. The money helped, obviously, but it didn't undo anything. Sophie, for her part, had taken the whole situation better than I ever could have hoped for. She never once made me feel like a burden or an inconvenience. If anything, she leaned into it, introducing me to her friends as her cousin visiting from out of state, since explaining the actual truth wasn't exactly an option around the 2-month mark. I started going by the name Sophia. At first it was just easier at coffee shops and doctors' offices, then trying to explain why my ID didn't match my face. But slowly it started to feel less like a cover story and more like it actually fit. I remember the first time someone called me Sophia without me having to correct them first, and instead of the usual internal flinch, I just felt myself smile. Sophie, and I started spending almost all our time together, partly out of necessity since she was still my only real anchor to how any of this was supposed to work, but it slowly became something more than that. We'd go out for coffee, for walks. She started introducing me to little things that made this whole new existence easier. Her favorite little boutique for finding clothes that actually fit. A hairdresser who didn't ask too many questions, small practical kindnesses that started adding up into something that felt suspiciously like an actual life. One night we were sitting on her couch watching some show neither of us were really paying attention to, and she turned to me kind of suddenly and asked, "Hey, be honest with me. If they came to you tomorrow and said they figured it out, they can switch you back, would you actually want that?" I sat with the question longer than I expected to before answering. A few months ago, I would have said yes. Instantly I told her, honestly now I don't actually know. She smiled at that. This small, quiet smile, and said that was more than fair. By the 4th month, I had officially stopped hoping for a call from Nextlink saying they'd cracked the reversal code. The engineers had moved on to other projects, the corrupted data long since scrubbed from their systems in the name of liability protection. And honestly, the version of me sitting on Sophie's couch most nights had mostly made peace with that reality. I had a new name. A slowly growing sense of how to move through the world in this body, and somewhere along the way I'd developed something with Sophie that neither of us had really planned for, but neither of us wanted to walk away from either. I still think sometimes about that pod, about the flickering lights and the warning message I never got to read before everything changed. There are still moments, usually late at night, where I catch a glimpse of my reflection and feel a small echo of that old disorientation, a flicker of the person I used to be before an experimental piece of software decided otherwise. But those moments come less often now, and when they do, Sophie is usually right there to remind me that whoever I used to be, I get to decide who I am now. I don't know if I'll ever fully explain to anyone outside of Sophie, and a handful of very confused former coworkers what actually happened to me that day in the pod. And honestly, at this point, I'm not even sure I need to. My old life is gone in every sense that matters, deleted from a database somewhere along with whatever backup could have brought it back. But the life that's replaced it, messy and strange and completely unplanned as it is, isn't one I'd trade back even if I could. Thanks for watching this video. More videos will be coming very soon. We would really appreciate it if you would like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.